By Jason Sokol, who's assistant professor of history at the University of New Hampshire, also author of the book All Eyes Are Upon Us: Race and Politics from Boston to Brooklyn, The Conflicted Soul of the Northeast. Let's talk about that conflict. What do you talk about in the book, Jason, that is this conflict when it comes to race and politics in this part of the country?
Well, I argue that in the Northeast, there have basically been two dueling traditions of race relations. On the one hand, the cities and states of the North that I study, Massachusetts, New York, and Connecticut, have often leapt ahead of the rest of the nation in terms of being able to forge breakthroughs in interracial democracy and racial equality. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I show how these cities and states have been just as deeply committed to patterns of racial segregation and episodes of racism and racial violence as anywhere else in the country. So those forces have been at war, I argue, throughout the North's history and even up until today.
I find this so fascinating because as someone who grew up in Massachusetts and saw a lot of what you wrote about firsthand, and now living in New York, in Brooklyn actually, see a very different approach that still has these kind of two sides to race relations. I was so interested to read about what you wrote. Let's start a little bit with Massachusetts, because of course
Sure.
Massachusetts has this kind of reputation as this progressive stronghold of forward-looking on race relations, LGBT rights, of course. But at the same time, Boston does have a pretty ugly history of racism and segregation. We see it very much so with sports during the 60s and 70s. And even if you look at Boston, a city that on paper is relatively diverse when it comes to racial demographics, you don't see that in so many parts of Boston because the racial diversity is sort of segregated in particular neighborhoods. Dorchester and South Boston this was very, very present to me, and so many people I talk to have seen the same things, Jason, that you write about in the book. What other elements of this am I missing in this kind of superficial analysis of Boston?
Well, it's true. Many African Americans for a long time thought of and still think of Boston as a racist place, as a racist city. Bill Russell, on the one hand, was the first African American to coach a basketball team in the NBA. On the other hand, he called Boston a flea market of racism, quote unquote. So it didn't have a good reputation for African Americans. Um, in some ways, it still doesn't. But if you look at, for instance, black politics, Massachusetts has been a place where African Americans have been able to win white votes and to win major offices. I tell the story of Ed Brooke, who was elected as the first African American to be popularly elected to the U.S. Senate ever, and that was from Massachusetts in 1966. I take the story right up to Deval Patrick, elected governor in Massachusetts and then reelected. So I think in some moments, Massachusetts has been able to make good on the lofty history and has shown itself willing to, elect African Americans in a way. 1966, Ed Brooke was elected in Massachusetts. That would have been absurd that any Southern state would have elected an African American to the U.S. Senate. So everything you say is true about the deep racial segregation in Boston. It's also true that Boston has been a racist place, exploded in violence over busing. But we shouldn't forget the other tradition in which Boston as a city and Massachusetts as a state has actually been a beacon at moments, small moments, but I argue important ones that we shouldn't forget and that we shouldn't underestimate.
In a review of your book, the Boston Globe said, All Eyes Are Upon Us is about the sizable gap between the North's ideals and its reality. Do you think that that's a good way to kind of contextualize why there may be this discrepancy that we see sometimes in the Northeast? The idea that The ideals are very strongly stated and heard by many, but something makes the reality fall short of those ideals. And if so, what do you think is keeping the reality from falling short of the ideals?
Well, I think it's true. And, this is a lot of what we're talking about here is white Americans and their ability or their inability to really commit themselves to what it means to living in an integrated and a racially equal nation. So, in terms of the ideals, many white Americans, white Northerners, have always had a commitment to racial integration in the abstract. If you ask them, are you in favor of racial equality and racial justice? They would say, yes, of course I am. And this is what, for instance, Massachusetts residents would say in the 1960s. But then if you ask them, well, are you committed to sending your white student to a school with African Americans? They say, well, it depends what school, depends exactly how that works out. If you ask them, should they be compelled to sell their home to an African American if that person puts in a bid on their home? They would, in the 1960s, they would have not necessarily said yes. So there's been many white Northerners have had a distinction between what it means to be for equality in the abstract, and then they hesitate to take the steps that are really required to bring that society into being. And so that's what I think is relevant and resonant about the notion of the gap between the ideals and the reality.
So this, I think, gets us pretty smoothly into our discussion about New York City and Brooklyn. And when I moved to New York City from Massachusetts, I was immediately obviously aware of the fact that as you walk around in your regular day, you see exponentially more racial diversity, particularly in Western Massachusetts, where I started my show. There is an almost total lack of racial diversity. You basically just see white people. And initially I thought that speaks so well of New York City. But then once I got beyond this kind of superficial level of I see all sorts of people, you start to realize that as you take a subway from Yankee Stadium, for example, through Manhattan and into Brooklyn, that the racial makeup of that train is initially very diverse and starts to kind of whiten as you go through Manhattan. And then slowly but surely, the white population starts to shrink in relation to who's on the train as you enter and head into Brooklyn, into the outer parts of Brooklyn. So give us a sense of what we really are seeing in New York, where there's this kind of superficial diversity and integration, but we still have pretty significant lines drawn between neighborhoods, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, New York has always been unique, partially because of its size. You know, 7, 8 million people packed into the city. And that does allow for an everyday interaction between the races that you don't see in many other places. New York has a reputation from its founding as a melting pot, a multi-ethnic place ever since the Dutch founded it hundreds of years ago. Today, what you see is also a very complex reality. You're right. On the one hand, you have more races in closer proximity in New York than anywhere else. Even the black community itself is complex. You have Caribbean Americans, you have African Americans originally from the South, you have African Americans from New York City itself. But you also have entrenched patterns of spatial and housing segregation, as you say. And this began to take root during the years of World War II, during the years of the Second Great Migration, which was when millions of African Americans came from the South up to northern cities. They settled in New York City. Harlem already had a thriving black community. But for those migrants who didn't end up in Harlem, they were usually corralled into very specific parts of Brooklyn, meaning the neighborhood, what we know of as Bedford-Stuyvesant now, which is still the heart of the black community in Brooklyn. And as you're on your subway train, this is where you see many of the African Americans getting on or getting off, right, in the Bedford-Stuyvesant community.
No question about it. Although the amount of gentrification that's happening in Bed-Stuy is also incredible in the last 5 years.
Right. And this is an open question in terms of what's going to happen to the African American community in Brooklyn, up against this gentrification and the growing wealth really everywhere in Brooklyn. But in those years of the 40s and 50s, when African Americans came to Brooklyn and settled in Bed-Stuy, then you had a lot of whites moving out of central Brooklyn and moving to the outer areas that you're talking about, Bay Ridge, Bensonhurst. And those communities became sort of little white villages in the middle of the century. And then you also had a lot of a lot of white people starting to move to Long Island and to the suburbs in these same years. And so my book does tell the story of how Brooklyn became racially segregated in this way. The irony is that white people moved to their own exclusive neighborhoods in exactly the same years that they started rooting for Jackie Robinson. So this is another sort of duality, complexity that I show in my book, that on the one hand, the white Brooklynites can welcome Robinson and proclaim themselves to be the frontier of interracial democracy on the one hand, and on the other, they can flee to their own segregated, exclusive neighborhoods where they don't want to have anything to do with African American families.
Last thing, Jason, in the limited time we have left, if you had to say what the most important or powerful potential truly unifying force when it comes to race relations, not one that creates this kind of superficial openness to racial integration, but one that truly has an impact, what would it be, historically speaking?
Well, I think when communities have committed themselves to integrating their neighborhoods and to integrating their schools, when white people have been willing to make the quote unquote sacrifice, which isn't actually any sacrifice, I think that's paid real dividends. You know, when communities have committed themselves to low income and mixed housing, and when school systems have followed through on radical, widespread plans to make sure that their schools had actual mixed makeups, I think those communities have seen positive returns, and they've showed that it can be done. We aren't just fated to a segregated society.
Let me remind everybody, the book is All Eyes Are Upon Us, Race and Politics from Boston to Brooklyn. We've been speaking with the book's author, Professor Jason Sokol from University of New Hampshire. Really great having you on. Thank you.
Thanks, David.